still related to wealth and related to money, but slightly different. And one where we are thinking about how can we utilize our wealth in a way that benefits us, and in a way that benefits us more than perhaps we're already doing. So it's titled Smarter Sadaqah. And really we're thinking about how can we, if we want to use financial terms, how can we get the best ROI? Right? That's really what we're thinking about. How can we get the best ROI on our investment? That's what we are looking for when we make investments, is what is the return on that investment? And really that's what we're going to be thinking about today. And I want to start with just a little bit of an introduction to the concept of wealth, because it's such an intrinsic part of our daily life, and yet it's a thing that has no actual value in and of itself, if you think about it. Like, you can't eat your money, you can't, wear it, you can't live in it, but rather it's a means to something else. It's not intrinsically valuable, it's valuable because we put value in it. And yet, we can't live without it. It's not possible. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. And the ulama say, if you look through the books of tafsir, that what is al-khair? It's al-mal, it's wealth. So man's love for wealth is intense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ with tawqid. It's not just strong, but it's very intense. This is part of our nature. It's part of the fitrah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the prescription here about what is the remedy. أَفَلَا يَعْلَمُ إِذَا بُعْثِرَ مَا فِي الْقُبُورِ. Immediately thinking about there's going to be death and there's going to be a resurrection. وَحُصِّلَ مَا فِي الصُّدُورِ. And all of our secrets and everything within our hearts and chests will be made public. That awareness will enable us to operate with wealth in a way that is beneficial, as opposed to a way that will harm us in this dunya and then in the hereafter as well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. And there's many ayats in the Quran that talk about this concept of wealth. And we're in the Bay Area, and this ayah, I was thinking about it, and it's perhaps very prevalent here. يَحْسَبُ أَنَّ مَالَهُ أَخْلَدَ. Right? People, Silicon Valley, like one of the things to really focus on is this, idea of people investing in something that will make them live forever. There's all kinds of science and investments being made. يَحْسَبُ أَنَّ مَالَهُ أَخْلَدَ. Allah says that this person, he thinks that his money will make him eternal. It's not going to. And the reality is that nobody can take their wealth with them. This is agreed upon universal principle, that nobody can take their wealth with them. We're all going to leave this world, and we're going to leave without our assets. And normally that's a prelude to, the estate planning conversation. But I'm going to skip that conversation today, and we're going to talk more about the waqf conversation. But the point of that introduction is to say that no matter how much a person has, it's not going to go with them. And you also can't take it with you literally, like bury it in the grave. Like if somebody, today we've lived with this mentality that we can do whatever we want. But if someone said, you know what, I want to bury all my wealth with me, that's my will. Whatever I have, throw it in the ground with me. People would say that person's crazy. Like any person who doesn't believe in an afterlife would still objectively say that that's crazy. And there would be grave robbers and people would be stealing. Right? So people realize that this wealth will not benefit you after you pass. Except if it's utilized correctly, then all of it will benefit us in the hereafter. And that's what we're aiming for. So, inshallah, tonight we'll talk about the few concepts themed around waqf. And for most people, it's a new concept. I mean, we know that it's prevalent in Islamic history and we'll talk about it. But really, how can we create that within our life in a way that benefits us, our family, the community, our generations to come, that will be continuous, inshallah. So we'll talk about sort of the objectives, different types of giving under Islamic law, different forms of giving. Some history, because you can't appreciate the richness of our Islamic tradition without understanding the role of waqf in the development of those civilizations. And then moving from theory to practice, what is the modern analog to waqf in contemporary society? So we'll look at how other groups are using this concept, and then what are the tools specifically that we can utilize to create those same awqaf, albeit at a micro level, right? We want to start at a very small level, and then inshallah from there we can grow, and then we will take questions. But it is Friday night, that said, and I do want to give the people that are here an advantage over the people who are online, right? So that means you can feel free to interject and make it conversational. If there's something you don't understand, go ahead and ask. Just make sure it's relevant to the slide or the topic. Like if there's anything that's not clear or anything that you want to discuss or follow up on, go ahead. Because it's Friday night, and I appreciate that it's a lot easier to just click on the live stream, and mashallah, that's good too. But for everybody who came, inshallah, I want to make sure that we are participating. Is there anything else that you guys want to get out of this, actually, since you came? Is there anything else you want to get out of it so that I can frame accordingly? Anybody? Any questions you had coming in that you think I didn't mention as a... Wills and trusts I'm going to touch on, but I've done a couple presentations here on wills and trusts in this masjid. So those are online. And we have a bunch of content on wills and trusts already. I'm going to mention them in the context of giving and awqaf, but the main subject of wills and trusts is not tonight's topic. Yeah, there's a few from this masjid on that subject. Okay. Anything else? Very good. So just as you know, I'm an attorney, so I start with the disclaimers. Anybody who's worked with an attorney knows that's the first thing you start with. And this is just to say we're talking about general advice, right? Not financial advice, not legal advice. This is just general. Everybody understands that. Also, we're not covering all the different tools and techniques and possibilities related to all advanced tax planning. We're sitting in the masjid, so I actually took out some of the denser tax stuff, and we're going to focus more on the concept, the history, and then the modern contemporary application. Of course, if you want further development of these topics and conversations, you can feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to assist, or these are things that you can certainly find more about online as well. So, as we said, the whole point of this, what is the objective of everything we do, is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's our goal, first and foremost. One time I did this talk. Actually, before I even did the talk, I sent an email, and somebody responded and said, the topic, or the email, this idea of smarter sadaqah, this is an oxymoron, because you're mixing tax benefits with niyyah, and you know that if your niyyah is not for Allah's sake, then you don't get any reward. I was like, Jazakumullah khairan, right? But I disagree. When we talk about the context of giving, of course our niyyah first and foremost fundamentally is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Absolutely. Right? And that has to be it. Because we know, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are but based on intention. Right? And if the intention is wrong, if the intention is to show off, if the intention is not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it doesn't count. And he's absolutely correct. But if you also have the ability to, at the same time, save taxes, I see nothing wrong with that. And in fact, I see that as something that we should aspire to, because there's two ways to save taxes. One is to cheat and lie, which is illegal and haram. And one is to utilize the tools that we have at our disposal to legally save taxes. And we start with this notion of objectives to mention that strategic tax planning is both legal and smart. It's both legal and smart. And there's a famous line from a Supreme Court case in which the justice mentions that there is no patriotic duty to give more than you owe to the government. Like, if somebody says, you know what, like I'm feeling extra patriotic today, so I'm going to go ahead and pay extra to the government. Like, do you get extra credit? Does there any benefit to you? Not at all. And in fact, if you pay extra to the government and you don't claim it back, they won't give you a refund. Like if you just happen to pay a few extra $1,000 or tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds or millions of dollars extra, and you don't do the math, or you don't realize that you missed certain things, they actually don't give it back to you. They won't say, sorry, you made a mistake, you paid too much, here's a refund. You have to request it, you have to show that, I overpaid because of X, Y, and Z, my accountant missed these things. So if there's a way to save more, utilizing legal tools, we should aspire to it. And plus we know that our tax dollars are not being utilized in ways that we would agree with, or that are in ways that are efficient. And so and again, there's lots of tools. I'm not going to talk about them. We're going to talk about the charitable tools specifically, right? And in the charitable context of waqf, it is using private money to do public good. If you look at Islamic civilizations, there were privately funded public life. And that's essentially what we're going to try to do with the notion of these foundations, right? Is privately funding public life. And so there may be things you think you can do better that the government will say, absolutely, go ahead and take a charitable deduction and start providing these services. And it's an option, something that we should take advantage of. And of course, I will say this as well, there's a lot of schemes out there, and there's a lot of charitable tools that are not Sharia compliant. So when we start with and we lead with the notion of we're trying to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you cannot do something haram and say that the ends justify the means, right? I had a client once, he was like, you know what, the interest rates were really high. He was like, I think I'm just going to take one of these, interest-bearing things and then I'll donate it all to the masjid. How does that sound? They're giving me a really great rate. It seems like no-brainer to let them just leave the money there, right? The ends don't justify the means. So no matter what tax you're saving or what non-profit you're benefiting, we have to utilize and employ tools that are permissible and that are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that frame is just important. Now, the different types of giving in Islam. So we have zakah, as we know, as one of the 5 pillars. I would say of the 5 pillars, the most perhaps one that people know the least about. I mean, we all know the absolute fundamentals, but in its application, there's a lot of confusion around what is zakatable, what is not zakatable, how do we pay, what are the acceptable recipients, all of those things. So we should study the rules of zakat because it's one of the 5 pillars. And we shouldn't play games with our zakat because it's only 2.5%. It's a very small amount of the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. And it's actually a purification of our wealth. Literally, it's purification. And so this is the absolute minimum of a believer. right? And there's so many questions around, do I have to, do I have to, do I have to? This is the floor, like this is the starting point of our giving. And then we have our above and beyond. And in the above and beyond category, generally, sadaqah, there are different types. There is a sadaqah you could give. You know, the first one I mentioned, and one not that people generally don't think about, is this notion of this qard al-hasana. You can give a good loan to someone. It's also beneficial. You'll get the reward, right? An interest-free loan. And that's a form of helping someone in a difficult time, and you'll get the principal back. Then there's sadaqah that we can just give, like when there's a fundraiser at the masjid, or there's someone in need, and you give, and the money is used, and you get the reward, and the thing is finished. Let's take an example that's simple. There's somebody who's hungry, and you feed them. Great job, right? That's a wonderful sadaqah that we can give. But once that person eats their meal, it's finished, right? What's better? They say, like, you know, is it better to give someone a fish or teach them how to fish? To create a method of sustainability, or to create something that will continuously benefit people and therefore and thereby benefit us. The Prophet ﷺ says in the famous hadith that إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنَ آدَمَ انقطع عمله إلا من ثلاثة كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, that when the son of Adam passes away, their deeds are finished except for three things, and of those is sadaqatun jariyah, a continuous charity, a perpetual charity, a charity that keeps on benefiting even after you pass. You know, we think about, like, everybody works and then the goal is to have some passive income, some side hustle for the passive income. That's what everybody wants to do. Or works a whole lifetime to save up for 5, 10, 15 years of retirement where you don't have to work, and the effort that you put for the 25, 30, 40 years of working will now provide you with what? Passive income, right? Your retirement, your social security, all of these things that you're building are essentially a form of something that you hope to benefit from when you don't have to actively work. And think about it, that's for what? 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years at most? Right? If somebody retires at 60, how long can they possibly live? We're talking about for eternity. For eternity. We want that benefit to continue. So sadaqatun jariyah, أو علم ينتفع به أو ولد صالح يدعو له, or a beneficial knowledge. Right? Think about the ulama and how we continue to benefit from their books. Right? Imam al-Nawawi's book, Riyadh al-Salihin, read in every single masjid in the world, or Imam Ghazali, or Ibn Kathir's tafsir, or you name, right? That the benefit continues forever. The scholars, the teachers of Quran, right? The Qurra who taught, and they taught their students, who taught their students, who taught their students, who taught their students, who taught their students, they're still getting the reward thousands of years or hundreds of years later. Beneficial knowledge. Or a righteous child who will make dua. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us righteous children and grandchildren who will make dua for us, and great-grandchildren and generations to come who will raise their hands and make dua for their forefathers. So this is sadaqah jariyah. Now, among the sadaqah jariyah possibilities, this subcategory then is waqf. And that's today's topic. So what is waqf? Somebody tell me. Let's make it interactive. Endowment. Well, we can't trade words for words. So what is endowment? Okay. So a waqf is maybe translated as an endowment. And that would be something which you invest, you take the principal, you allocate it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the profits are then used to benefit the charitable activity. Okay? So the principal is not being depleted, but rather is growing. So when we think of endowment, that's what we think of, right? We think of a concept of you donate an asset. Let's take an example like a building. It's easy to comprehend. You donate a building, and what would be given in charity? The rent, for example, right? The rent. The rent would be then donated, or perhaps a portion of the rent would go to fund some causes, and then the principal continues to stay or grow, and maybe you take a portion of the rent and you reinvest that in the waqf as well, right? But that's the idea, is that the principal is not being depleted. Now, where does this start? Is the word waqf in the Quran? Is this concept described in the Quran? Ahqaf. So there's no direct usage of the term. The term isn't mentioned. Okay. But the concept comes from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Comes from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So what would be the first waqf? Let's go through some examples from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and then from the Sahaba, and then we'll look at some Muslim societies and some examples. So dating back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, barakallahu fik, what are some examples of what are some examples of waqf? Very good. Ahsant, right? So let's go even before that. The Prophet ﷺ comes in the Hijrah. What's the first masjid? Masjid Quba. So that's a waqf. Remember, this is something, the principle is allocated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we're thinking about, does it necessarily have to have an investment component, like a store or a property or something that's generating? That's part of it. But something that is dedicated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost, right? So all of our institutions on some level are falling under this category, of which no person owns them. This is the critical piece, is that when something is made waqf, the ownership is transferred to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, we're going to come to the modern context, because you can't just be like, okay, this belongs to Allah. Like, how does that, what is the process of which you can take it out of your ownership, right? There has to be a process. Otherwise, if an asset is owned by somebody, what happens on death? It's inherited, right? Either through your will, through your trust, or through the probate court system. There's going to be an inheritance to it. So even if you had said, for example, I make my house waqf, and you just said it, and you made the niyyah, like, the government's not going to recognize that, right? Because you didn't do anything, you just made a niyyah. And maybe you wrote it on a piece of paper, maybe that's not going to work either. So there's definitely a process in our times, which we'll come to. But historically, you could just make a niyyah, right? As the first step of this belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Masjid Quba, Masjid al-Nabawi are examples of the earliest of awqaf. From the time, yes? Correct. Yeah, so because there's perpetual benefit happening inside. Like, think about how many salahs are happening in the masjid, how much Quran is being recited, how much i'tikaf is happening, how much, sadaqah, how much sadaqah is being given even in the masjid itself, right? Like, so the benefit is continuing in this place, right? But let's go to the clearer examples, right? From the time of the Sahaba. What are some examples, because this will be more clear now when we talk about the principle and the income, right? So now let's think about some examples of waqf from the seerah and from the time of the Sahaba that you can think of. Very good, right? So some famous examples, right? Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anh, right? In the famous time when the Muslims went to Medina Munawwara, they were having a hard time getting clean water. And so there was a person who owned a well. The Prophet ﷺ, he went to him and said, I'd like to buy the well. The man said no. And the Prophet ﷺ, and then Uthman radiallahu anh, he went and he purchased the well, and he dedicated it to the Muslims, right? And it's mentioned that he would have, in the beginning they had a half day, like every other day. And so on the day of Uthman radiallahu anh, he would let everybody come for free and use the well. And so on the other day, nobody would go and pay the guy, and then eventually he was able to buy the entire well. So this is an example of something that was continuously beneficial. A well that Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anh started. What's another example? The date garden that you visit as well. Another in the trips you'll see of Sayyidina Uthman, and you see, because the well is also benefiting the garden, providing water for the dates. The dates are then being sold. So how does the investment component work? Is the water is also then being used to grow the trees are then being used, the actual fruits are being sold, and that's essentially a waqf that lasts till today. It actually lasts till today, subhanAllah. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says that, Ya Rasulullah, I have this land in Khaybar that he got after one of the battles. He says it's very valuable. I would like to donate it. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says to him that it's better, why don't you dedicate it and use the income of the land to benefit your relatives, and then by extension the believers. So this is an example of an actual waqf that the Prophet ﷺ is telling Sayyidina Umar that take the principle, make it a waqf. The habs is the term, not waqf specifically, but habs. So that land, the principle, is going to be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the income that's generated from this, it will go to your relatives and then to the Muslims. And this was something that Sayyidina Umar did, and it's mentioned that afterwards, so many of the Sahaba, they continued to follow in this example. Jabir radiallahu anh mentioned that every companion who could afford it created a waqf. This is how prevalent it became at the time of even at the time of the Sahaba, right? The ayah is revealed, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. Sayyidina Talha radiallahu anh comes and says that this garden is most beloved to me and I would like to give it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It becomes part of waqf and then becomes eventually part of Masjid al-Nabawi. Again, think about the continuous perpetual benefit. So these are examples from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we look then at Islamic civilizations, the waqf became the dominant social institution, such that it's mentioned in late Ottoman times, almost 50% of the land was waqf. Almost 50% of the property was awqaf property. And you can see this also, 1/3 in Tunisia, 1/5 in Egypt of the properties were awqaf properties. Like that's how much of the property had been dedicated, and only the income and the profits were being distributed, but these properties then were not being inherited. They were fully within the waqf system. So much so that people could create, and this is what I think is most analogous to today, people could create awqaf that were specifically doing certain social benefits that they liked. It's really amazing. Ibn Battuta mentions, the famous traveler, he mentions in Damascus that there were awqaf for like very interesting things. For example, there's a famous waqf that if a child broke a pot, like they were carrying something, they had to go do something, they broke a pot, they could go to this waqf and trade in the pot for a new one. There were awqaf for women who were getting married and didn't have like jewelry or a wedding dress. They could go to this waqf and they could get these things, either take them or borrow them for their weddings. Like very amazing examples of what people liked. Awqaf for animals. I mean, think about when you go to visit Istanbul, how many cats there are, right? There were awqaf for specific types of animals with specific types of disabilities. There were awqaf, of course, the famous examples, the hospitals, the universities, the masajid, right? In every major Muslim city, the masjid is the center point of the city, and what is it surrounded by? Awqaf, right? Typically shops, right? The rent of which was being used to fund the masjid. Like if you think about our masajid today, and I mean it's hard to think about this when we're like in capital raises all of the time, but those masajid once established, they're self-sustaining. They're self-sustaining because the properties around the masjid were waqfed. They were awqaf properties, the rents of which were then going to pay the salaries. So Islamic universities, right? Hospitals. There were awqaf providing salaries for people to go and, from the cradle to the grave. The graveyards are awqaf, the hospitals are awqaf, the schools were waqf, the libraries were waqf, the masjid was waqf, the madrasa was waqf, right? Everything was waqf. And these were not necessarily government-controlled awqaf. This is the important part. This is private awqaf that are established. The mutawallis are not the government. They are individual families and trustees that are providing social benefits. And what does this do? It creates the autonomy for the ulama. Like what is the biggest problem? And actually the colonialists, right? What did they do immediately when coming to Muslim lands? Okay.
So donating something to the masjid or donating something for the sake of Allah, is it the same thing in terms of like technicalities?
Yeah. I mean, yes, inshallah, sadaqah jariyah, continuous charity, right? In any form, when you're giving to the masjid, it's sadaqah jariyah, right? Because you're going to give and it's going to benefit, even be it indirectly, something that will last beyond our lifetime, inshallah. And so therefore, no matter what you give, right, it will be used and you will continue to get some benefit for it. But the difference in waqf giving is that you can actually grow your principal. There's a difference. Like in waqf, when we use the term generally, like this property is waqf, so yes, if you give, you will continuously get the sadaqah jariyah component. But when we talk about investments that can grow, right? Like if the masjid has its own waqf, and let's say the masjid invests in a rental property, right? And you give to that fund, that's different. Because that portfolio will inshallah continue to grow. So think about the portfolio grows. As the portfolio grows, the returns grow. As the returns grow, they are then brought back into the masjid. So that's the multiplier effect that's present in waqf giving that may not be present in the single time, like food that you give to someone, the single meal, right? Or even in the general masjid donation, right? Because it'll be used to buy new carpet or to do some, capital project, of which there will be perpetual benefit, inshallah, but not necessarily in the growth way. But this is what I mean to say the distinction is. right?
So what I was thinking is, like, for example, MCA owns the building right next to it, and MCA gets the rent from that building. So that building, let's say if someone donated that building, but it transferred the ownership to MCA.
Yeah.
Is that same to saying that that building is donated for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Yeah. I mean, it's all for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when you give, like here, when we say waqf, it means it comes out of the person's ownership. This is an important part. It's a perpetual gift that's out of your ownership. If you, for example, own a store, and you say, I'm going to give 10% of the profits to the masjid, continuously. Like you have a restaurant, and you say, 10% of our profits will go to the masjid, right? That's a great promise, but it's not a waqf, right? Because you still own the restaurant, right? So it's your restaurant, you're giving a portion of the proceeds to charity. But if you said this entire restaurant is now waqf, right? And all of the profits will go to charity, and it's no longer within my ownership. Again, then we'll have to move to the how do we actually make that happen, which we'll come to, right? That's different. So that's the distinction. So a person who gives in this waqf model, it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the person's ownership. This is a big difference between those two between those two models. So what happens when the colonizers come to Muslim lands is one of the first things they destroyed was the awqaf. One of the first things they got rid of were the awqaf. Why? Because that eliminated the autonomy of the ulama. If you think about today, we critique a lot of scholars in the Muslim world and the things that they say, but do they have autonomy to say what they want? Do they have autonomy to say what they want? No. Right? Their salaries are from their governments. And if they break from their government positions, they lose their job at best, or they end up in a much, much worse position. I mean, it's easy for us to critique, right? But what was present in those societies, the private awqaf were funding the ulama. So they could say what they want. And it allows the development and the independence and the deep scholarly tradition that was present in our civilizations, which allowed Islam to flourish. Like in large part because of the waqf tradition. This is a very, very important point. That Muslim societies were running on awqaf. And till this day, when you go and visit Muslim societies, you find this. Right? And even contemporary, if you look at India today, right? One of the things that they're actively and aggressively doing is trying to eliminate the awqaf that are present there, right? The current ruling party there is aggressively trying to eliminate the awqaf that still to this day exist. To some extent, obviously the British had messed up a lot of them, and then over time they're diluted as well. But in every society, there was an attack on the waqf system. And now there's this idea of, okay, we need to resurrect it. We need to realize across the Muslim world that this institution, which we had as such a integral part of our society, what can it provide not just for us but for the world at large? So as we mentioned, there were awqaf for roads, there were awqaf, of course, for institutions, Al-Azhar, right? Nizamiya, Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad, all of these were waqf institutions. Let's look at the modern analogs to this. What's Ensign Peak? Anybody know? It's one of the largest endowments, if you will, in the world. Anybody heard of it? No? Mormon Church. Okay? Mormon Church, right? So it's called Ensign Peak, so nobody knows what that is, right? But it's the Mormon Church investment arm. It's I think 2025, I just saw a statistic I was pulling up. Its investment arm was some 50-some billion. And then that's not including any of the actual assets. that it owns, which is perhaps, a few hundred billion more. Okay? The Catholic Church doesn't have public statistics, right? But you can think about the global holdings and the investments. So when we talk about these endowments, they're hard assets that they own, and then there's actually investment arms to these things, right? So they hold equities, like public equities, large holdings in various public equities, as well as private equity. So when you think about the largest endowments in the world, many of them are the preeminent educational institutions in the United States, right? What's Harvard's endowment? Anybody know? How much? I think it's like 50 or so. Okay. So some of these Ivy League endowments, 40, 50 billion dollars. Now, to fast forward a little bit, and we'll come back to this, what allows them to grow so effectively? First, understand the concept. What does the endowment do for the university? Like, how does the endowment function? How does it work? It's a form of funding, right? So essentially, the endowment, like what's an endowed chair? Right? There's a chair that's created for a position, a teaching position, which is funded by a position out of the endowment, right? So when you give your money and you give to the endowment, is being invested by some of the best managers in the world. They're investing, and the income from that endowment is then being used to fund activities, education, capital projects, whatever, at these institutions. How do they grow? Because the profits from these endowments are tax-free. So understand the difference here, right? When you invest in your brokerage account, what happens when you sell your NVIDIA? Capital gains tax. What happens when Harvard sells its NVIDIA holding? No tax. Now this might change under the current administration, because this is one of their big attacks, that we're going to start making universities pay tax on their $50 billion holdings. But understand some of the secrets here is that the foundations, the nonprofits, generally aren't paying tax on their gains, which is different than the average person and the public, or any corporation that's not structured as a nonprofit. And that's a huge difference. When you talk about, investing, and you talk about what do people say most about the benefits of funding your retirement accounts? What's the term that's used all the time? Pre-tax for sure, but then grows tax-free, that compounding factor, right? Anytime you're talking about a retirement conversation, right? If we're talking about pre-tax contributions, the benefit is described as it's pre-tax, and perhaps there's a match from your employer, and the growth inside is what? Until you take it out. It's deferral, but it's growing tax-free, right? And at some point in the future, somebody's going to pay tax. So it's not actually tax-free. As you said, it's a deferral. The growth, however, there's a huge advantage, though, to not have to pay tax every time there's a transaction. There's no realized gains as you go, because the entire amount can then be reinvested. And so the compounding factor is what allows the growth to go at a much higher return rate than up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down every time, right? So these universities are taking advantage of the system. The concept is one that is very much rooted in our tradition and our universities. This, like, sometimes we take credit for like random things, like everything outside, but really this is a notion that was very much fundamental to Islamic educational institutions hundreds and hundreds of years before these institutions were even established. Right? Almost 1,000 years before these institutions were even established. Now, globally, that's one example, right? Then there's also this notion of non-educational institutions or non-religious institutions, also of which are having foundations. One of the largest is actually this Novo Nordisk Foundation. I believe it's in Denmark. And this is a, potentially over $100 billion foundation. So the foundation can also have holdings in actual business interests, right? And having components that are doing active businesses. The Gates Foundation, as you know, right? So there's some of these huge foundations. They have arms that are doing deployment of that capital for the charitable causes, and components of which are being just the best wealth managers in the world are going and figuring out how do we invest this money. And again, the benefits of that money are that they can grow tax-free. Now, another example is this idea of a community foundation or a donor-advised fund. Who's familiar with that concept? What is that? Anybody want to share? What's a donor-advised fund?
You can donate to it.
Yeah.
And then you can give the money later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something like that. Anybody else want to elaborate? Yeah, so this is kind of like a simple version of the foundation we're going to talk about, right? But there's some pretty important distinctions between the donor advised fund and creating your own nonprofit. Okay, so a donor advised fund is itself a 501c3 charity. Okay, so if you look at the community foundations, for example, in every major area, there's over $100 billion of aggregate wealth in these community foundations. But they are the owners. And you are, what is your role after you give money to the DAF? Say it's a Schwab or a Fidelity, or any of them, right? There's Muslim ones as well. In the Bay here, there's American Muslim Community Foundation. The largest are Schwab and Fidelity. The community foundations are large. There's a number of these. So once you give them the money, whose money is it? It's in your name, but it's their money, right? Because it's not yours anymore, because you are only it's a donor advised fund. So you're advising what to do with the funds, right? Now, yes, practically speaking, you're going to tell them what to do and they're going to do what you say. But legally, you're just the advisor, right? You no longer have full control. The other problem is that you have limited choices, typically, of how those funds are being invested, right? And the third is that you can't actually do the charity work yourself. You can only grant out to public charities that are doing those kinds of activities, which may be fine. Okay? Let's say, for example, you want to actually take the profits of your investment and you want to go and feed people or do actual work, of nonprofit work, of charitable activities yourself. Inside of the DAF, you're not going to be able to do that. You're simply going to be able to grant it to the masjid, and then the masjid will do that, or to the relief organization, or to the educational institution, or the hospital, or etc., which is still great and wonderful, but perhaps a limitation. When we move to the concept of foundation, it's going to allow you to do all of that, but it's also going to allow you to do the charitable work yourself, right? Which is different. And particularly for a lot of people who send money overseas for charitable activities, this is going to be an opportunity to be able to do that, right? Again, subject to all of the regulations and subject to all of the compliance and all of the rules that are still going to be applicable, but it still opens up an opportunity for those things. So, now, mapping out the concept of waqf into a contemporary application. Like we said initially, when we think of waqf, the first component of waqf is that you make a niyyah of an irrevocable, perpetual gift to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? You could just say that this is now waqf. But you can't do that here because that's still part of your estate. So what are the tools that we can utilize that perhaps will bring something into the sort of realm of waqf mapped out on legal tools? And I think there's three possibilities. The first is a charitable remainder trust. Anyone familiar with that? After Isha, we're going to break for Isha in a couple minutes. We'll talk about these three more, inshallah. So this will be a good stopping point. And then inshallah we'll talk about the practical tools that we can utilize for creating a waqf today. So a charitable remainder trust is the first of them. Has anybody created one, familiar with one, know how they work? Alright, so in short, you basically transfer appreciated assets to this trust. The trust sells them, and then either you or a family member or both or some combination of people will have an income stream that is allocated over a period of time. And then at the end of that period, or the end of your life, or at the end of your husband and wife's life, whatever kind of term is set, the remainder at the end of that term would go to a public charity. Okay, so it's one concept. Maybe this works. It's not fully analogous. You could utilize irrevocable trusts, which are advanced trusts, where there is a trustee, there are beneficiaries. The question is, what about the charitable remainder? Because remember, there has to be a charitable component. So this is a potential use case. But the most analogous is this concept of foundation. The most analogous thing that we have today is the concept of foundation, right? At a more simple level, it's the donor advised fund. But I think there are some problems with the donor advised fund that don't map as neatly to the concept of waqf. But it could work as well. It could potentially work as well. At a simple level, that could be a starting point, or that could be one we start with or get familiar with before going deeper into the concept of foundations. So we'll talk about these three, inshallah, after. Any questions before we break, or should we just stop here for adhan?
I think we should stop for adhan.
Okay, so we'll stop for adhan, inshallah. We'll come back and we'll do about 30 minutes after Isha to go through how to create these tools and then take questions after that, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum.
Jazakallah khair, Hafiz. So those that are watching online, just put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them during Q&A. Those that are in the room, inshallah, just keep your questions in mind, inshallah. We're going to have azan now. Those watching online, we're going to keep the stream going so you can continue to tune in. Assalamu alaikum.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
لا إله إلا الله اللهم احسن وقوفنا بين يديك ولا تخزنا يوم العرض عليك عاملنا بالإحسان إلى الفضل منك وإليك اختم لنا بخاتمة السعادة أجمعين. We need to finish this line, brothers, before starting another line, please. Oh, okay. Sorry. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. إن الذين كفروا بآياتنا سوف نصليهم نارا كلما نضجت جلودهم بدلناهم جلودا غيرها ليذوقوا العذاب إن الله كان عزيزا حكيما. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات سندخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا لهم فيها أزواج مطهرة وندخلهم ظلا ظليلا. إن الله يأمركم أن تؤدوا الأمانات إلى أهلها وإذا حكمتم بين الناس أن تحكموا بالعدل إن الله نعم ما يعظكم به إن الله كان سميعا بصيرا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. ألم تر إلى الذين يزعمون أنهم آمنوا بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك يريدون أن يتحاكموا إلى الطاغوت وقد أمروا أن يكفروا به ويريد الشيطان أن يضلهم ضلالا بعيدا. وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا إلى ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول رأيت المنافقين يصدون عنك صدودا. فكيف إذا أصابتهم مصيبة بما قدمت أيديهم ثم جاءوك يحلفون بالله إن أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا أولئك الذين يعلم الله ما في قلوبهم فأعرض عنهم وعظهم وقل لهم في أنفسهم قولا بليغا. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله استغفر الله استغفر الله وأتوب إليه اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام تباركت ربنا وتعاليت يا ذا الجلال والإكرام اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك اللهم لا مانع لما أعطيت ولا معطي لما منعت ولا ينفع ذا الجد منك الجد ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم وعافنا واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا فإنك أنت الغفور الرحيم اللهم عافنا من بلاء الدنيا وعذاب الآخرة واعف عنا يا رب العالمين واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين اللهم اشف كل مريض يا رب العالمين اللهم يا شافي الأمراض يا داوي الأسقام اشفنا واشف مرضانا ومرضى المسلمين أجمعين آمين
We're going to continue the workshop in about 8:20 or so with Hafiz Yaser. A reminder that we have Sheikh Yahya Rosas here tomorrow from Pennsylvania. He will be here from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to talk. You can still register on the website. Jazakallah khair. Also a reminder that we have the Fall Fest on Sunday. I believe it's from 4 to 8 p.m. And join us with your whole family, inshallah. We'll have food trucks and a lot of games. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, my sisters and brothers, we're ready to restart our very important discussion going on here in the prayer hall, so please head back inside. If you have a conversation going, please continue the conversation, but take it out into the lobby. And those that are watching online, please type your questions into the chat box, and we'll get to them during the Q&A portion. Jazakallah khair.
How do I know? Okay. Did you plug this in because it said low battery? No, it's fine. We're good? All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. All right, so picking up, there was a number of questions that people had about some topics that we're going to cover, inshallah. And they all have to do with moving from theory to practice. So the theory has been established that the most effective way of giving, the highest return on investment, is going to be waqf giving, where you are growing the principle, ideally. And so it continues in perpetuity to grow. And we see examples historically till this day from the time of the Sahaba. You know, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anh, they have that hotel that it continues. They still apparently like a bank account from that waqf that he established at that time. And then in modern context, in the non-Muslim context, you see this prevalence around higher education institutions and their ability to grow massive amounts in the tens of billions of dollars, as well as other nonprofit organizations. And you can see how they utilize this tool to essentially achieve the benefits of the historical waqf. And the historical waqf, the point I'm going to try to press again, is one in which we are emphasizing that the public benefits are being provided by private entities and by individual managers, not by government institutions. That's a key, right? That's going to be a key. So what's going on here? So the concepts I mentioned were potentially a few of how do we map that historical concept of waqf into our modern, living in America context. And so the first of those, as I mentioned, is a charitable remainder trust. And these are just possibilities, right? These are possibilities. So when would that be useful? That would be a tool, say you have an appreciated asset. Take some highly appreciated stock. Okay, you guys are all Bay Area people, so the stock example works better. There's some highly appreciated holdings that you got from your company or that you invested well, and you're sitting on large gains. And what you can do with the CRT is essentially transfer them to this CRT, meaning charitable remainder trust. And there's different types, and again, the disclaimer at the beginning is that this is high-level conversation. Of course, these things need a lot of depth. Excuse me. So what happens is the charitable remainder trust doesn't pay tax when it sells the stock. So you think, okay, we're getting close to, a bubble. I want to go ahead and capture the gains. I don't want to pay huge amounts of tax when I sell these shares, because remember, the capital gains tax is a problem. So the charities don't pay tax, and the charitable remainder trust is a charity. And so that trust is not going to pay tax. However, there's going to be a structure of which you will receive an annuity payment, meaning like a fixed percentage of the principal each year for some number of years. And you could set this up on different terms, 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever. And what happens is you get payments from the trust and you're taxed as those payments come out. So it's not eliminating the tax, but it's more of a deferral technique. I think it's because this computer is off. Yeah, it's not on. Maybe just the battery's dead. So you pay out, and then at the end of that term, whether that's the end of your life or the end of the term, the remainder has to go to some charity. Now, this could be coupled with your own charity, and you could have that work. But this is one tool. Not perfect. As you can imagine, the annuity payments will deplete the principal, perhaps at a rate where the principal is decreasing pretty significantly, such that at the end of the term only 10% goes to charity, which is the minimum required rate. We're talking about something where the principal does not deplete. That's the real ideal waqf, right? The principal does not deplete. So again, you can see this one doesn't map out perfectly, but it's a good, effective tax planning strategy tool, at least for smarter giving. Because part of what we're trying to do is, utilize the tax tools that we have that are, part of the code, so that we can give better, and if we save more, then we can give more with the amount that we save more, right? So we can utilize our tax savings for things that we care about, whether or not they're in the designated waqf bucket or not necessarily. So that's one concept, yes. Correct. Yeah, so in the donating shares, so in the levels of giving, not here in the waqf conversation, just general giving, you can give cash, but it's almost always better to give shares, right? Because not only are you going to get the same charitable deduction, but you're going to save the capital gains tax that you would have otherwise had to pay. So you're right. The difference in the remainder trust is that you aren't giving the shares to the charity. Rather, you are going to receive an annuity payment spread out over time. Let me make like a real example. Let's say you bought NVIDIA a long time ago, okay? And you're sitting on $1 million of NVIDIA stock now, highly appreciated, okay? So one option is you can donate the $1 million to the masjid. Just transfer the stock, the masjid gets $1 million, and you get the hasanat. Great, right? Another is to say, well, I need this money. So I want some of it to go to the masjid, but I also want to benefit some of it. So you set up a 10-year, charitable remainder trust, whereby you won't get $1 million of tax in year one, but you'll spread out the tax over 10 years, and you'll have a lower bracket, and you'll pay a portion of that tax as the profits come. Meanwhile, in that 10-year duration, the money is going to be invested again, perhaps in some other thing that you are going to choose. And then at the end of year 10, whatever amount is left is going to go then to the masjid, right? So that's it's a tool in which you are investing a component, personally benefiting from part of it, and then the charity is also receiving a benefit, okay? So the direct donation to charity, absolutely, you can do, of the share. But then the charity gets the full amount, okay? Whether that's going to the waqf or it's going to the masjid. Brother Munir, what's the waqf, what's the masjid waqf look like here?
We have a renter that pays rent towards the masjid, but we're currently using that for our construction, long-term construction thing. Right now we're operating off membership fees and donations.
I see. So if somebody wanted to donate to MCC's waqf, is that a thing?
No, we don't have a waqf.
Okay. So we need to get there, right? We need to get there so that we can have donations allocated to the waqf. And this is the question that was raised a couple times, is if I just give to the masjid, is it generally a waqf? It's generally a waqf. But if there's a waqf component that's designated, that's different, right? So that's a CRT. An irrevocable trust, as we mentioned, there's different kinds of trusts. Many of you are familiar with them because we've done planning for you. So you're familiar with the revocable trust, which is the base kind of trust that we do for everyone who is looking to avoid probate and ensure their wealth passes based upon Sharia. That's like foundational in America for Muslims and in general for non-Muslims, and especially in California because California probate is very inefficient and expensive. An irrevocable trust is a more advanced tool, generally for asset protection, generally for tax strategy. And one of the mechanisms here potentially could be using an irrevocable trust for the establishment of a waqf. Because it's advanced, I'm going to skip that one. because it needs a lot more discussion. Then we move into the bucket of foundations, right? And the question of how can we establish our own charities that would fit here. So when we talk about foundations, I'm using the term generally. This could be a private foundation or this could be a public charity. There's two general concepts under the tax code. One is a private foundation and one is a public charity. Anybody heard of the difference or can think of the difference? What is it?
Private foundation is limited in how many people are donating.
Exactly, right? And so the concept here is that a private foundation is funded by a family or maybe a small group of people, and a public charity is something like the masjid or say a relief organization or some other organization which gets most of, or at least a large percentage of its wealth from the general public. And the idea in the public charity realm is that if there's something shady happening, there's naturally going to be some check against it. So if all of a sudden, you start donating and, you see the board members are all starting to drive really nice cars, but the cause that they were raising money for doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, like it's going to raise some red flags. Of course, this doesn't happen here. I'm just making an example. And you say, okay, maybe I should check, where's my money going? So naturally, when you give, there's some sort of consequence and there's some sort of accountability that comes with it in a public charity. But in a private foundation, you're giving essentially to an entity that you control, and there's no third parties involved. And so the government has more scrutiny than naturally on the private foundation. There's a lot of compliance and there's a lot of rules around foundations. But they could be either. Now, you get a tax deduction when you transfer money to a nonprofit entity. Whether that nonprofit entity is further deploying the capital for the purposes of a charitable activity or not. This is a key, right? So you're having a good year. This is usually when we get these calls, November, December, that I got a bonus, I sold an asset, my company got acquired, whatever, and I am going to have a much higher tax year this year than I anticipate in the coming years. Like some people, mashallah, they have a tax problem every year, right? It's a good problem, mashallah. But then some people have a liquidity event or some sort of something happened, and it's like usually like this, and then all of a sudden there's a spike. So what happens if you have a spike year? What does the government say? Pay us the spike tax as well, right? They're not going to say, okay, well, go ahead, you can spread it out over 10 years, it's all good, right? Unless you utilize a tool. And so one of the tools that we're going to talk about is the foundation, because when you put the money into the charity, you take the tax deduction. Remember, it is a charity, even if the bulk of the money is only being invested and deployed to charitable activities later. And again, this is the same in the DAF. This is the same in the donor advised fund, right? Where you can take the deduction now and you can then donate it over time, to the specific charities. But here I'm talking about actually doing the work. So why do I think this is most analogous? Because again, the examples that I mentioned, if we look at Muslim civilizations, they were families that were funding things that they cared about. So you can imagine a waqf that was established for masjid carpets. Somebody said, you know what, there's masjid projects happening all the time. I want to be the waqf that provides carpets for the masjids. Very narrow use case, right? Or, to stick with the masjid construction example, like wudu, right? Like there's a waqf for wudu facilities. And you know what? They get so good at it that you just you contact them every time you're building a masjid instead of trying to begin, because what happens every time we start a masjid? We reinvent the wheel. We try to find architect, and then we find contractors, and we find people who've never done it, and then they make mistakes, and it's just a circular thing. But imagine if there's a waqf where they just specialize in this, right? And they're either then doing all of it fi sabilillah, or they have some mechanism by which they have efficiencies that are created inside of this waqf, right? A masjid sound system, right? You just go, it's an off-the-shelf order, and it can be deployed at scale. But it's like somebody who cares about this thing that's going to just take their capital and say, this is what I care about. Or, as I said, it doesn't have to be in the realm of the masjid, right? The charitable waqf of providing wedding dresses to girls who can't afford them, or jewelry for, brides, or there was a waqf so that someone could come and get the mahr that he had to pay to be able to get married. There was a waqf for that, right? Or there was a waqf for someone dies and what happens to their pets. There was a waqf for that, right? There were all kinds of awqaf because the category is so broad. Like the idea of sadaqah is so broad within our tradition, right? We know that a person goes to Jannah, right, for feeding an animal. So it's a very broad possibility of things that you really care about. Arts, right? All kinds of different categories could fall under the waqf, especially in this way. So you see family foundations that do exactly this. They narrowly define what they are interested in and they go all in on that. Or it could be broad. You could just say, for example, we want to help people that are suffering, and this could be poverty alleviation, this could be food, this could be providing clean water, it could be hospitalizations, it could be Quran teaching, it could be whatever, right? So you can have any number of categories. Again, the tax-free growth is a huge component here. Put in the money now and then allow it to grow. Now, another reason why I find this to be very effective is because you can, again, this is different from the DAF, from the Donor Advised Fund, you can employ people out of this foundation as well. So now you imagine you create a foundation and there is funding and there is work, so naturally there can be employees, right? Is there a prohibition on those employees being from your family? No. Is there a prohibition of you being an employee? No. Now again, everything has to be reasonable and subject to scrutiny. You can't set up a foundation and pay unreasonable compensations. You're going to get audited, right? But if there's reasonableness, subject to market, that foundation is a charity which can employ people, and those employees could be people that are qualified from within people that you know. And you could also employ them in the future. Maybe not today, but maybe there'll be a time when they will be trained so that they can carry on the financial legacy intergenerationally within the family. Was there a question? Yeah.
Assalamualaikum. If you're benefiting from this foundation,
Yes.
right, or your family members are benefiting from this foundation, doesn't that like mangle the intentions that you have with it? Right? Like this is for Allah, fi sabilillah.
Yep.
You're saying this is to benefit others.
Yep.
And self-benefit seems done to.
Good. So the question is back to intentions here. Is it possible to personally benefit? Now I want to differentiate concepts of benefit in the tax law and in Sharia, right? So the idea of personal benefit in a foundation from a tax law perspective is not allowed. But here we're talking about employment, right? And so not a personal benefit as far as like you receiving like any investment income or anything like that. That's not allowed. That's you're not an owner of the nonprofit, you are simply a director, right? Just like the masjid, right? Nobody can take any profits. That's a non-profit. There's no owners, right? There's only going to be directors. There's no shareholders in a non-profit. This is the important distinction, right? So let's say that there was millions and millions of dollars in profit to the masjid. The board members could not say, okay, we'll go ahead and take distributions like you could in a corporation. You cannot, right? Now, a salary is different, right? A salary is in exchange for work that is being performed, okay? And that would be permissible. Now, again, subject to market rates and all of that can be easily determined. Now, from an Islamic perspective, the question becomes, is it possible to benefit from the waqf? Okay? And remember the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to Umar radiallahu anh. What did he tell him? That you make the principle, you dedicate the principle to Allah, and you make the income for your family members. The poor family members were the ones who were specified. So the ulama mentioned that you can be a permissible beneficiary of the waqf, right? of the income can be, a person could create a waqf for themselves and their family as permissible beneficiaries. Of course, if you don't need it, then you wouldn't do it, right? But a person could say, for example, I'm making this house a waqf, and it's going to be for, and these are subject to more scholarship, right? I'm giving high level examples. But a person could say, like, for my family to continue to live in after I die, and for my grandchildren. And so there's a waqf that's established, and there is benefit intergenerationally. People can come and stay in this home or vacation home or things like that. But the ultimate, or if it's in, maybe a contemporary example might be something like there's this Airbnb. People are coming, and you could say that like the family members could use it or something, and then it's also rented out. And the profits are going to charity, right, as one example. So there's some personal benefit that you can have in that, and also some charitable. But that's not going to map into this, because that's going to be personal benefit in the foundation, which will not be allowed. So in the classical sense, it would be allowed in the waqf, but it would not be allowed in a foundation. So that's not a good example. That's why I don't like doing things on video. So you'll just scratch that one. That's not a good example. Okay? But you can see an example of how under Sharia you can be a permissible beneficiary of the waqf. And the ultimate beneficiaries are then going to be charitable beneficiaries. But family is considered charity as well. This is important. This question was asked earlier as well about, how much can you allocate? And there's the hadith of Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, is very famous in this regards. A person, he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was thinking that he was dying. He was thinking that he was dying. He was sick, and he says to the Prophet ﷺ, like thinking that he is in maradul maut, he's in end, this is the end. And he says he wants to allocate 2/3 of his wealth to charity. And the Prophet ﷺ said no. And he said half. And he said no. And then he said 1/3. And the Prophet ﷺ said, فَالثُّلُثُ وَالثُّلُثُ كَثِيرٌ. You can do 1/3, and even 1/3 is a lot. And the point that he makes here is that it's better not to leave your family members dependent on others. So at the end of one's life, you can't leave whatever you want to charity. The cap at that point is 1/3, the rest is inheritance. However, in your lifetime, when you're healthy, when you're well, you can do whatever you want. You can allocate more. So now, where the waqf comes back in is you have these illiquid assets that you can't actually donate to charity because you need to benefit from them while you're alive. So that dedication of waqf would allow that, right? Again, now mapping onto the foundation context is not going to work perfectly. You're not going to be able to say, I donate my house to my foundation, and I'm going to continue to live in it. That would be impermissible under the tax code. Whereas it would be permissible under just pure fiqh, right? But mapping onto a tool, it wouldn't work in a foundation. Yeah.
Sorry. Just actually feeding off that point that you made, right? When I was thinking about charitable remainder trust, or even when you talk about giving your house or large assets into charity, do you have a responsibility to make sure that the people that are your responsibility are taken care of before you make such major decisions, right? Even if you're not at the end of your life, right? So that they have adequate provisions before you say, well, I'm going to put this large asset.
Yeah. And I think the hadith alludes to that question. The hadith specifically talks about that point, which is it's better not to leave your dependents, your family members, dependent on others. Sometimes I get this question, I want to donate all my wealth to charity. It's a nice intention. People say, I want to give all my wealth to the masjid. For different reasons. Sometimes people are like, my kids aren't good, they're spoiled, they don't need anything. You know the billionaires giving pledge? You guys have all heard about it, right? They say they're going to give all their wealth to charity, they're going to leave nothing. We earned it, so they should earn it too. Different notions, some for whatever reasons, right? So I get this a fair amount of time, which is like, you know what? Hard work is good for my children, and so therefore I don't want to leave them anything. Shar'an, you can't do that. You just can't do that, right? You can give your stuff away, like in your lifetime. You can't do it in your will and trust. You could theoretically do it in your lifetime, but it wouldn't be good. It would not be something that's recommended, that you impoverish your family and you do sadaqah projects in the process, right? You should obviously take care of your dependents, and we know that sadaqah to the family is the actual first recipients, right? That's where your charity goes first. So to that point, yes, you shouldn't do high-level philanthropy unless you are in a position to do so. So especially when people have young kids, for example, I recommend this all the time, is like, don't make large gifts to charity. Do donations you want to make in your life, but when you're not around, they're going to need that money, so it doesn't make sense to do large gifts. Who are we talking about? We're talking about people who, think that they have enough and their family will have enough, and then we can talk about these conversations. So it's important to know who the beneficiary, who is the right person to do these things. Now, smaller things, like you could use a donor advised fund potentially, but that would be like maybe like for smaller gifts, but not large gifts. Now, one other reason to touch on this point is a lot of people in our planning want to make death gifts, bequests. It's very, very common. Alhamdulillah, the Muslim community is so generous. I mean, almost everybody asks, like, as part of my estate plan, I want to have some sadaqah jariyah. Like, I want something that's going to last beyond me. That's part of what precipitated, my sort of research and also like focus on this concept. And what's so interesting is that, why is it possible to do that? Because we know the money you give in your life is better, like you get more reward. Of course, because it hurts more when you give today versus when you give when you're not around. However, the way our economic system works is that you have more illiquid assets that you are able to gift when you die that you can't when you're alive. What are examples of those? What are the main examples? Your house, for instance, right? You got to live in it, right? So you could potentially gift it after you die or after your spouse dies or something, is an option. What else? Insurance. Some stocks, particularly stocks in retirement accounts, right? Because now retirement accounts are just, the complexity of modern assets is such that if you have a 401k and you want to donate and you work for your employer, and it's a large 401k, you've been working in tech for 20, 25 years, you have a pretty sizable 401k, you're 50 years old, can you donate it? Is there a mechanism? You can't. There's no way. You got this large amount of money, but you can't do anything with it. There's literally no way, right, to give that asset to charity. But what about when you die? Now you can. So like the pool of money on death is often much, much larger than what a person can give in their lifetime. And so that's why bequests in today's age are even more valuable to discuss. And as institutions that we should be thinking about getting. Because everybody has that opportunity where they might not actually be able to use. Like, I see it in my practice all the time. I mean, people have, because you're taught you should put into your retirement. You should put into your retirement. Your employer will match. You've been working at companies where the stocks have gone, multiples in return. There's a huge asset that you can't use in your lifetime. And you might only use it for a few years after you retire. And even then, people don't like to pull it out because they don't want to pay the taxes. And so people often die with very large, I mean, some people die with none, but some people die with very, very large retirement accounts. Now, who's going to pay the taxes on those? The beneficiaries. Somebody's going to pay the tax on them. The only way you avoid paying the tax on them is what? Donation. The only way you avoid paying the tax is donating them to charity. So now, once we go through that conversation, people say, okay, well, I'd like to donate it to charity. The question is, what charity should I donate to? And this comes up a lot. And this is where, probably the masjid boards are going to disagree with me and say, well, obviously the answer is MCC. Give to the masjid, which is fine. And your local masjid is actually an easy one. Because, you care about your local masjid. But for a lot of nonprofits, people say, you know what, even if I agree with everything the nonprofit is doing today, how can I guarantee that they'll be good stewards of this money, they'll use it the way I want, or who's going to be in charge, or are they even going to be in existence? Can we guarantee any of those things? We really can't. So what if we created our own foundation, and our family is now running that foundation, and we set the rules and we train our children for multi-generational philanthropy, and we talk about the causes and we teach them stewardship? What if we tried that approach? That's where this came about from, in terms of like, now a person who has a multi-million-dollar 401k or some house or rental properties or whatever that's willing to put a portion of them can do so very confidently and comfortably, because who's going to be in charge? Their family. And they'll be able to carry on the legacy, or they'll be able to, continue to invest. SubhanAllah, the Quran talks about financial literacy and teaching wealth management strategies so amazingly. The Quran says, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى. What does وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى mean? Literally, it means test an orphan. What does that mean? It means give them some money, see how they do before you give them more. An orphan is, inheriting $1 million. The Quran says, وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ. Don't give someone who's foolish your money. They're not ready to take it, don't give it to them. فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَادْفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. Once you determine that they've reached rushd, then you give them their money. You test them. It's teaching financial maturity, right? Like, so many times we see, like, what was rushd in that day? Like a 14-year-old, 15-year-old was like, so mature, so responsible, right? Could we give large amounts? I mean, we're going on a tangent, but could we give large amounts to a 20-year-old today, or a 22-year-old, or a 21-year-old or something? Like, probably not, right? So it's very interesting. So the Quran talks about some of these things, right? It talks about, in the story of Musa alayhi salam, there's an anecdote to and al-Khidr. There's an anecdote to estate planning there. What was that story? What was the point? The father, what did he do? He buried the inheritance of the orphans. وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا. Their father or grandfather in some narrations, great-grandfather in some narrations, was a righteous person. He knew that the stingy people of the town would take that wealth. So what did he do? He buried it under that wall. And what did Musa and al-Khidr do? They came and fixed it, because they were still young. And if they didn't, and the wall fell down, the orphans wouldn't get any money. So the idea of preservation of wealth is present within our tradition. It's not like a bad thing to plan. Quite the opposite. So this is where I think the idea of a nonprofit is incredibly valuable. And again, not everything maps out perfectly. The vacation home example that I gave previously perhaps works in an irrevocable trust. It would not work in a foundation where you or your family can use it. But it could work in an irrevocable trust, right? It wouldn't be a tax benefit. It wouldn't be a tax benefit, but it would achieve the waqf objectives. But if you're trying to get a tax benefit as well, this foundation is one of the best vehicles for it. Because again, in your lifetime you can set it up, you can establish it, you can fund it continuously, you can invest, and you can invest and compound and grow tax-free in Sharia compliant things. And then you can have a large death gift that goes into that foundation as well. You can do direct charitable activities inside that foundation, right? Whether that's domestic or international. And it can be funded with cash and like cash as well. So classically, the waqf was funded with assets, right? Like properties and such that are not going to depreciate in value, right? We said part of the idea is preserving the principle, right? Preserving the principle was the classic definition of a waqf. But in the modern context, the ulama have said that cash awqaf are possible, even if they're going to eventually be depleted to some extent. Although ideally, your return is going to exceed the distributions. Good. question was, how do you do international donations? So remember, when you set up a charity, there's two types. There's public charity and private foundation. In a private foundation, generally what you're doing is making grants. You're just granting to other public charities. And then when you give internationally in a private foundation, you're subject to a lot of scrutiny, because you have to be able to make sure that the dollar goes to the final recipient as a charitable beneficiary. You can't just give to a foreign charity or to an individual and say, I did my job, as a private foundation. Now, but if you set up a public charity, and again, there's a lot of nuance, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but let's just suffice it to say that you can set up a public charity that is managed privately. Okay, you can get the best of both worlds. If you're interested, you talk to me after. Okay, so what happens is, in a public charity, you are doing charitable work. So think of yourself like a micro Islamic Relief, or a micro Helping Hands, or a micro, any charity, right? How do they do their charity work, right? The same idea, if someone comes to the masjid and says, I want to receive zakat, there's a process. There's an application form. There is some scrutiny, that is, objective criteria that are established, right? So if you send money to Egypt to your brother, and that's the end of the inquiry, that's not going to work, right? But let's take an example of, you want to feed 100 people every night in Ramadan for iftar. Now you're in the realm of programs, right? It's very easy to establish that that is a charitable endeavor that would be eligible charitable, here, of course. And now you can have you contract with the caterer, you can have all of the documentation that's needed. So by and large, when you're doing this yourself, you have to be running programs, okay? And there have to be objective criteria around those things. What's interesting is that most of our community is already doing that. And do you get any deductions when you send the money overseas? No. But is it a charitable activity? Absolutely. Now, are you willing to go through the scrutiny that is required to achieve those things? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no, right? And so if the answer is no, then the answer is no, and then you don't do the thing. But if the answer is yes, then I'm willing to think of yourself as a masjid board member. Like, someone comes to this masjid and wants zakat. Do you just give it to them? They look good, so sure? No, right? Is it a relative? You say yes? No, that's not going to work, right? So you can't use the foundation to give money to some relative, or to pay for your niece's college, or for all of these things. These would all be violations of the rules. But let's just say there is a class of people in a village that you are funding, right? And you're making a water well, or you're creating a masjid, or you're doing a Quran school, or you are providing food for a number of people, or you're providing employment opportunities for people that don't have employment opportunities, right? Or you take care of, like, buying their fridge and oven, or rental housing subsidies. All of these things are charitable activities that can be run by individuals at small scales. And to give you some perspectives, there's over 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. It's not a small amount. Like, we know the big ones, right? But this is to say that there's a large amount of nonprofits in the United States, okay? And Americans donate $500 billion a year to charity, okay? And a lot of that goes to smaller charities, right? It does not all go into, St. Jude's, or, the very, very large charities that exist. 25% roughly is donations to religious organizations. So a huge amount does go to religious institutions. And this last point is important. Charitable bequests were about $45 billion in 2024. That's realized bequests, right? That's money that came in, distribution. So there's a lot of money that passes, and we're thinking about how can we allow more of our money to go to the causes we want. If you take that example of the retirement accounts, and let's say somebody has, $1 million 401k, a third of that's going to go to the government. And let's say their net worth is $5 million. So they're allowed to give the entire, and this is where estate planning becomes very valuable. By picking the right asset, you can eliminate a few $100,000 of tax. If you said in your estate plan, I want to donate 1/3 of my, let's say they have $3 million, and they say, I want to donate 1/3. The kids are already adults. they're already married, they're already, financially independent, they're all doing well. So we satisfied the initial thresholds of should we do this. So you say, I want to donate a third when I die. And you have $1 million house, you have $1 million 401k, and you have $1 million stock account, stock and cash. And you say, let's make it easy. I'll donate the stock and cash. When I die, I'll donate the stock and cash to charity, and then I'll give the retirement account and home to my kids. So what was the tax benefit of that? The tax benefit of that was zero. Why? Because when the kids take out they will pay the tax, and they don't have the stock and cash to pay the tax now. Okay? Invert it and say you gave the $1 million of the 401k to charity. What's the tax benefit there? Well, there's no capital gains in the 401k, but there's ordinary income tax. So it's the elimination of $300,000 or more of taxes by picking the right asset. If you pick the 401k, that $350,000 or whatever of taxes that would have been paid is eliminated. The charity gets the full $1 million and pays zero in tax. The kids get the full $1 million of stock because there's a step up in basis, or cash because there's no tax, and there's also a step up in the house. So the point here is that picking assets is really important, and earmarking 401ks to a foundation. Again, it has to be a public charity, which is something you have to set up the right way, but can be very valuable. Yes.
I want to go back to your conversation about the foundation and ask about the Shari'i intentions that you need to have with regard to, can you allocate, for instance, zakat versus it's all sadaqah?
Yeah. So, good question. So we talked initially about intentions at the beginning, and this question about once you move to a foundation, now you have to have clear intentions about, was that fully, so can I pay my zakat from the foundation? It's a very good question, right? So think about it. If we said that it's a waqf, okay, so the entirety of the amount in that charitable vehicle is now what? Not yours. So therefore, you would not be able to use it to pay your zakat. And similarly, you would not be paying zakat on it as well, because it's not yours, right? So if you set up a foundation and you put in $1 million and your intention was that that money is being a waqf, okay, and it's now a waqf, so you couldn't use it to pay your zakat, you could also not use it, you would also not pay zakat on the $1 million because it's already, the entirety is going to be waqf, right? Contrast that with that spike scenario where we said, I need to prepay my zakat for the next several years. Okay? This is another common use case. I need to prepay my zakat. I want to go ahead and take the deductions now. Okay? And so there's other tools I didn't mention. For example, a charitable lead trust is an excellent tool for that. A charitable lead trust, right, is in a nutshell a trust in which you take a deduction now, you invest the assets, you pay an annuity to charity every year, and at the end you'll get the amount back. In that structure, you could pay your zakat from it because it's still yours, and you're going to get the amount back, and it's still, it's still part of your entirety. There might be an ability also to kind of use these tools as hybrids for both, right? That you're using the charitable foundation vehicle to try to achieve both, and so there might be a portion of it, hypothetically, that's your waqf, right? And there might be a portion of it that you're utilizing for the prepayment idea of taking the deductions for future zakat. Some of that's going to come down to intentions, and that's why I said here that none of these things map out perfectly. This is an important point, is that the classical structures, we live in a society where we have to utilize the tools that we can. They don't map 100%. So we're trying to find the best analog, and they're going to give and take. So in the irrevocable trust scenario, you might be able to get closer to a waqf, but you wouldn't get any charitable deductions. right? So that's going to work on some things, but not on others. In the foundation, you're going to be able to get the charitable deductions, but you're not going to be able to do some of the things that you might still be able to do in a waqf. And then for zakat purposes, we have to be really clear. Another point about DAFs, and we're going to close because we're passing 9 o'clock. Query when you use a DAF for zakat, I don't know if that works. Because again, when you transfer the money to the DAF, it's no longer your money. It's very common people use the DAF as a zakat giving tool, and inshallah it counts, wallahu alam. But if you want to be technical, the DAF money now belongs to Schwab or Fidelity or whatever. It's their money now. So is it still yours that you can give zakat from? Wallahu alam, right? But if you want to be technical, I don't think we should compromise on zakat. I think the zakat should be like perfect, right? Use it as a sadaqah tool, then you don't have this problem. Use it as a sadaqah tool, but like on your zakat, you can't mess up. Like it's the minimum. So like as much as we want to give appreciated securities and use that, like what's better is the charities should have their own security accounts where you can transfer the securities directly, and you don't need to use the intermediaries if you're trying to give, you know, securities that way. Yes.
If I am privately managing the public foundation and want to help individuals,
Yes.
like with their medical expenses or educational expenses, can I do that?
You can if you do it right. Yes.
Okay. Can I transfer my 401k to the private foundation?
You cannot transfer your 401k to private or public. There's no way. You can make it a beneficiary upon your death, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, yeah.
On death, you may be able to do it to a private foundation, but you can certainly do it to a public charity.
Can I pay my zakat to the foundations?
Yeah, so you can pay, another good question. Can you pay your zakat to the foundation? So remember, by giving zakat to your foundation, you have not distributed anything to the charitable beneficiary. But could you give zakat to your foundation, which then goes and does the charitable work? Absolutely. Right? Like instead of giving your zakat to a charitable organization, right? So what happens in this? It's the same question actually. Like we give zakat, and I'm not trying to bash any institutions, but sometimes we give zakat to organizations that hold that money for very long amounts of time. Like you don't know what happens when you give your zakat to a relief organization. Again, I don't mean to say that or create suspicion. I just mean when you do it yourself, you know you did it. Like it's on you. There's nobody else involved. You're gonna make sure the money gets to the charitable recipient. Like that's on you now. So you could give it to your foundation. The foundation is a charity. The charity will do the charitable work. Again, you need systems. You need a process. You need all of that stuff to make sure that you meet compliance. Compliance is critical in any nonprofit. Compliance is the key. So understanding the compliance rules, all of that, working with a professional, this isn't a self-help thing, right? This is one where you're like, you need, now think about it another way. When you give to a charity, what's the average overhead of that charity? 5 to 7%. In some cases, it's much higher, right? So now, if you run your own charity, you need to earmark some compliance costs, right? Some accounting fees, some legal fees, because there's going to be an amount if you want to do it correctly, and it should be less than what, especially if we're scaling. I mean, at a very small level, maybe it doesn't make sense. But if you're going to be contributing, you're going to earmark some amount to make sure you do it right. Everything has to be by the book, if you will, right, in this world. It's very, very, very powerful if you do it right. There's a reason why, like, all wealthy families in America historically have these foundations, right? It's not just a tax play. It's intergenerational philanthropy, but also there's massive tax benefits as well, right? So we're past time. We wanted to stop at 9. It's 9:11. I know that, inshallah, it creates a lot of interest and awareness in the subject. For most people, I'm sure this is the first time this conversation is taking place. So if you have questions that you want to discuss further, you want to pursue this, especially before the end of the year, let me know. You can reach out. My contact is there. And if you just want other information, research and stuff, we can provide that as well.
So I have a question.
Yes.
First, if India is facing some issues by the government, how can we be sure that our work foundation is taking care of the Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we mentioned that like India is a place where that's actively being attacked, the institution of waqf, which historically is very, very large. Like Indian awqaf were very, very large historically. And so they were chiseled away by the British, and then recently, the last few years, by the BJP. So how do we ensure that our awqaf are protected in America? I mean, A, by following every rule, right? Because we're going to operate in the nonprofit realm, and nonprofit realm has lots of laws. And so A, it's following every one of those rules. Now, that said, to be honest, they can unilaterally declare it as terrorism, and there's no, way to challenge the designation. That was one of the bills, that they could unilaterally declare material support on someone, on a nonprofit. I mean, they're threatening to revoke nonprofit status on Harvard and things like that. So how can you guarantee? Well, you can't really guarantee anything. But one of the reasons I like this more than giving your money to a third-party institution is that there's one less middleman, if you will. Because if the government came and said, you know what, they're going to strong-arm the institution and say, we want X or Y, or we want you to freeze X or Y or whatever, I think it's different when you, I think a DAF is different. For example, if you have money, if you have an investment account at Schwab and you have a DAF at Schwab, I think they're two different things. One, they're a custodian. The second, they're an owner, right? It's two different things. Yes, they have fiduciary obligations and things like that, but I still think it's different. And so that's why I just think that having control, as much control as you can have, of course the government can still take the assets. Inshallah they won't, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. So it's a good point to finish on, which is to say at least we can eliminate outside scrutiny, outside, bad actors, but I don't think you can eliminate everything. I don't think you can, but that's the same with just a bank account. I mean, if they wanted to come and freeze accounts, they can freeze accounts. Certainly in the nonprofit realm, there has been a lot of discussion recently about rules that would allow for unilateral declarations of revoking status or of declaring material support and so on and so forth. So wallahu alam, obviously, this is where compliance comes in. This is where good accounting, good law comes in, but it doesn't make it, ironclad.
But it is also said that the waqf board wasn't using the money or the assets, mostly land. It's with the waqf board for generations.
Which is probably true to some extent, but also a couched argument. So it's a pretext to say that, these mutawallis were mismanaging, and so the government will come in and manage better. And so that's what the colonial powers did as well. They also came in and made the same arguments when they dismantled waqf in Muslim societies, arguing by and large corruption and things like that, which was probably true. To some extent. But, again, this becomes, when we privatize it, now, can you guarantee that your children and grandchildren will do a good job managing your waqf? Of course not. Are they going to care the same way you care? Of course not. But can we try to teach stewardship? That's all we can do. You do your part, and then the rest is tawakkal ala Allah, right? There's only so much we can do. Last point, and we'll close on this point, is there are now institutions that are being developed from Muslims, and that will allow sort of the financial maturity, where you can outsource a lot of this stuff into complex solutions, which will be ideal. Wealth managers and legal and tax and all of that put together so that you can have an outsourced sort of specialization. I think that is great, where you still are the direct managers, but you outsource a lot of it to specialists. And I think that, inshallah, is maybe the further maturation. Every masjid should have its own waqf. And I think every wealthy family should have its own waqf. That's my view, right? Every nonprofit should have a separate waqf to go along with its, primary objective. And then every wealthy family should have its own waqf. And maybe not everybody's there, of course, but once you reach that point, you have your revocable trust plan and all of that, and you also have your waqf component for philanthropy. All right, so jazakumullah khairan. We're getting late, so we'll stop here, inshallah. Happy to connect privately with those that are more interested, inshallah. And if you have feedback on the presentation, just let me know as well. I'd love to get feedback and improve it as we continue to develop this idea, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Hafiz. Sorry, always great that you take time to visit our community. We look forward to many more visits from you, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.